Hi folks, it's Andrew here at Plainfield Public Library and we're back with another episode from our classic serials series. This is going to be I think it's our ninth, our ninth part of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. We've been following through this story for a little while now. If you're interested in catching up with the story, there's a playlist that you can go to that has all the previous episodes recorded on it. So if you want to catch up, that's where to head on. In the meantime, we're going to get back into the story. It's a very psychological story. There's lots of stuff to do with a kind of unreliable narrator. And it's kind of, but maybe kind of not, a ghost story. Well, you'll have to read it or listen along to find out more about that. Let's carry on with chapter 21 of The Turn of the Screw. Before a new day in my room had fully broken, my eyes opened to Mrs. Grose, who'd come to my bedside with worse news. Flora was so markedly feverish that an illness was perhaps at hand. She'd passed a night of extreme unrest, a night agitated above all by fears that had for their subject not in the least her former but wholly her present governess. It was not against the possible re-entrance of Miss Jessel on the scene that she protested. It was conspicuously and passionately against mine. I was promptly on my feet, of course, and with an immense deal to ask. The more that my friend had discernibly now girded her loins to meet me once more. This I felt, as soon as I'd put to her the question of her sense of the child's sincerity against my own. She persists in denying to you that she ever saw or has seen anything. My visitor's trouble truly was great. Oh, miss, it isn't a matter on which I can push her. Yet it isn't either, I must say, as if I much needed to. It's made her, every inch of her, quite old. Oh, I see her perfectly from here. She resents for all the world, like some high little personage, the imputation on her truthfulness, and as it were her respectability. Miss Jessel, indeed, she's respectable, the chit. The impression she gave me there yesterday was, I assure you, the very strangest of all. It was quite beyond any of the others. I did put my foot in it. She'll never speak to me again. Hideous and obscure as it all was, it held Mrs. Grose briefly silent. Then she granted my point with a frankness which I made sure had more behind it. I think indeed, miss, she never will. She do have a grand manner about it. And that manner, I summed it up, is practically what's the matter with her now. Oh, that manner. I could see it in my visitor's face, and not a little else besides. She asks me every 3 minutes if I think you're coming in. I see. I, too, on my side, had so much more than worked it out. Has she said to you since yesterday, except to repudiate her familiarity with anything so dreadful, a single other word about Miss Jessel? Not one, miss. And, of course, you know, my friend added, I took it from her. By the lake, just then and there, at least, there was nobody. Rather, and naturally, you take it from her still. I don't contradict her. What else can I do? Nothing in the world. You're the cleverest little person to deal with. They've made them, their two friends, I mean, still cleverer even than nature did, for it was wondrous material to play on. Flora has now her grievance, and she'll work it to the end. Yes, miss, but to what end? Why, that of dealing with me, to her uncle. She'll make me out to him the lowest creature. I winced at the fair show of the scene in Mrs. Grose's face. She looked for a minute as if she sharply saw them together. And him who thinks so well of you. He has an odd way, it comes over me now, I laughed, of proving it. But it doesn't matter. What Flora wants, of course, is to get rid of me. My companion bravely concurred. Never again so much as to look at you. So that's what you've come to me now for? I asked. Is to speed me on my way? Before she had time to reply, however, I had her in check. I've a better idea, the result of my reflections. My going would seem the right thing, and on Sunday I was terribly near it. Yet that won't do. It's you who must go. You must take Flora. My visitor at this did speculate. But where in the world? Away from here, away from them. Away even, most of all, now from me, straight to her uncle. Only to tell on you? No, not only. To leave me in addition with my remedy. She was still vague. And what is your remedy? Your loyalty, to begin with, and then Miles's. She looked at me hard. Do you think he won't, if he has the chance, turn on me? Yes, I'll venture still to think it. At all events, I want to try. Get off with his sister as soon as possible and leave me with him alone. I was amazed myself at the spirit I had still in reserve, and therefore perhaps a trifle the more disconcerted at the way in which, in spite of this fine example of it, she hesitated. "There's one thing, of course," I went on. "They mustn't, before she goes, see each other for 3 seconds." Then it came over me that in spite of Flora's presumable sequestration from the instant of her return from the pool, it might already be too late. "Do you mean," I anxiously asked, "that they have met?" At this she quite flushed. "Miss, I'm not such a fool as that. If I've been obliged to leave her 3 or 4 times, it has been each time with one of the maids, and at present, though she's alone, she's locked in, safe. And yet... There were too many things. And yet what? "Well, are you so sure of the little gentleman?" "I'm not so sure of anything but you. But I have since last evening a new hope. I think he wants to give me an opening. I do believe that, poor little exquisite wretch. He wants to speak. Last evening, in the firelight and the silence, he sat with me for 2 hours as if it were just coming." Mrs. Grose looked hard through the windows at the grey gathering day. "And did it come?" "No. Though I waited and waited, I confess it didn't. And it was without a breach of the silence or so much as a faint allusion to his sister's condition and absence that we at last kissed for good night. All the same," I continued, "I can't, if her uncle sees her, consent to his seeing her brother without having given the boy, and most of all because things have got so bad, a little more time." My friend appeared on this ground more reluctant than I could quite understand. "What do you mean by more time?" "Well, a day or 2, really, to bring it out. Then he'll be on my side, of which you'll see the importance. If nothing comes, I shall only fail, and you will at the worst have helped me by doing, on your arrival in turn, whatever you may have found possible." So I put it before her. But she continued for a little, so inscrutably embarrassed that I came again to her aid. "Unless, indeed," I wound up, "you really want not to go." I could see it in her face at last clear itself. She put out her hand to me as a pledge. I'll go this morning." I wanted to be very just. "If you should wish still to wait, I would engage she shouldn't see me." No, it's the place itself. She must leave it." She held me a moment with heavy eyes, then brought out the rest. "Your idea's the right one. I myself, miss... well, I can't stay." The look she gave me with it made me jump at possibilities. "You mean that since yesterday you have seen..." She shook her head with dignity. "I've heard..." "Heard?" "From that child. Horrors. There," she sighed with tragic relief. "On my honour, miss, she says such things..." But at this evocation she broke down. She dropped with a sudden sob upon my sofa, and as I'd seen her do before, gave way to all the grief of it. It was quite in another manner that I, for my part, let myself go. "Oh, thank God!" She sprang up against at this, drying her eyes with a groan. "Thank God? It so justifies me." "It does that, miss." I couldn't have desired more emphasis, but I just hesitated. "She's so horrible?" I saw my colleague scarce knew how to put it. "Really shocking." "And about me?" "About you, miss, since you must have it. It's beyond everything for a young lady, and I can't think wherever she must have picked up the appalling language she applied to me." "I can, then," I broke in with a laugh that was doubtless significant enough. It only in truth left my friend still more grave. "Well, perhaps I ought to also, since I've heard some of it before, yet I can't bear it." The poor woman went on a while with the same movement. She glanced on my dressing table at the face of my watch. "But I must go back." I kept her, however. "If you can't bear it, how can I stop with her, you mean?" "Why, just for that, to get her away, far from them. She may be different, she may be free." I seized her, almost with joy. "Then in spite of yesterday you believe in such doings?" Her simple description of them required in the light of her expression to be carried no further, and she gave me the whole thing as she'd never done. "I believe." It was a joy, and we were still shoulder to shoulder. If I might continue sure of that, I should care but little what else happened. My support in the presence of disaster would be the same as if it had been in my early need of confidence, and if my friend would answer for my honesty, I would answer for all the rest. On the point of taking leave of her, none the less, I was to some extent embarrassed. There's one thing, of course, it occurs to me, to remember. My letter giving the alarm will have reached town before you. I now perceived still more how she'd been beating about the bush, and how weary at last it had made her. Your letter won't have got there. Your letter never went. What became of it? Goodness knows. Master Miles. Do you mean he took it? I gasped. She hung fire, but she overcame her reluctance. I mean that I saw yesterday, when I came back with Miss Flora, that it wasn't where you'd put it. Later in the evening I had the chance to question Luke, and he declared that he'd neither noticed nor touched it. We could only exchange on this, one of our deeper mutual soundings, and it was Mrs. Grose who first brought up the plum with an almost elated, "You see?" "Yes, I see that if Miles took it instead, he probably will have read it and destroyed it." "And don't you see anything else?" I faced her a moment with a sad smile. "It strikes me, but by this time your eyes are open even wider than mine." They proved to be so indeed, but she could still blush almost to show it. "I make out now what he must have done at school," and she gave, in her simple sharpness, an almost droll, disillusioned nod. "He stole." I turned it over. I tried to be more judicial. "Well, perhaps." She looked as if she found me unexpectedly calm. "He stole letters." She couldn't know my reasons for a calmness, after all, pretty shallow, so I showed them off as I might. I hope then it was to more purpose than it is in this case. "The note, at any rate, that I put on the table yesterday," I pursued, "will have given him so scant an advantage, for it contained only the bare demand for an interview, that he's already much ashamed of having gone so far for so little, and that what he had on his mind last evening was precisely the need of confession." I seemed to myself for the instant to have mastered it, to see it all. Leave us. I was already at the door, hurrying her off. "I'll get it out of him. He'll meet me. He'll confess. If he confesses, he's saved. And if he's saved, then you are." The dear woman kissed me on this, and I took her farewell. "I'll save you without him," she cried as she went. Chapter 22. Yet it was when she had got off, and I missed her on the spot, that the great pinch really came. If I had counted on what it would give me to find myself alone with Miles, I speedily perceived at least that it would give me a measure. No hour of my stay, in fact, was so assailed with apprehensions as that of my coming down to learn that the carriage containing Mrs. Grose and my younger pupil had already rolled out of the gates. Now I was, I said to myself, face to face with the elements, and for much of the rest of the day, while I fought my weakness, I could consider that I had been supremely rash. It was a tighter place still than I had ever turned round in, all the more that for the first time I could see in the aspect of others a confused reflection of the crisis. What had happened naturally caused them all to stare. There was too little of the explained, throw out whatever we might, in the suddenness of my colleague's act. The maids and the men looked blank, the effect of which on my nerves was an aggravation until I saw the necessity of making it a positive aid. It was precisely, in short, by just clutching the helm that I avoided total wreck, and I dare say that to bear up at all I became that morning very grand and very dry. I welcomed the consciousness that I was charged with much to do, and I caused it to be known as well that, left thus to myself, I was quite remarkably firm. I wandered with that manner for the next hour or two all over the place, and looked, I have no doubt, as if I were ready for any onset. So, for the benefit of whom it might concern, I paraded with a sick heart. The person it appeared least to concern proved to be, till dinner, little Miles himself. My perambulations had given me, meanwhile, no glimpse of him, but they had tended to make more public the change taking place in our relation, as a consequence of his having, at the piano the day before, kept me, in Flora's interest, so beguiled and befooled. The stamp of publicity had of course been fully given by her confinement and departure, and the change itself was now ushered in by our non-observance of the regular custom of the schoolroom. He'd already disappeared, when on my way down I pushed open his door, and learned below that he'd breakfasted, in the presence of a couple of the maids, with Mrs. Grose and his sister. He'd then gone out, as he said, for a stroll, than which nothing, I reflected, could better have expressed his frank view of the abrupt transformation of my office. What he would not permit this office to consist of was yet to be settled. There was a clear relief, at all events. I mean for myself in especial, in the renouncement of one pretension. If so much had sprung to the surface, I scarce put it too strongly in saying that what had perhaps sprung highest was the absurdity of our prolonging the fiction that I had anything more to teach him. It sufficiently struck out that by tacit little tricks in which, even more than myself, he carried out the care for my dignity, I had had to appeal to him to let me off straining to meet him on the ground of his true capacity. He had at any rate his freedom now. I was never to touch it, again, as I had amply shown. Moreover, when on his joining me in the schoolroom the previous night I had uttered on the subject of the interval just concluded neither challenge nor hint, I had too much, from this moment, my other ideas. Yet when he at last arrived, the difficulty of applying them, the accumulations of my problem, were brought straight home to me by the beautiful little presence on which what had occurred had as yet, for the eye, dropped neither stain nor shadow. To mark for the house the high state I cultivated, I decreed that my meals with the boy should be served, as we called it, downstairs, so that I had been awaiting him in the ponderous pomp of the room outside of the window of which I had had from Mrs. Grose, that first scared Sunday, my flash of something it would have scarce done to call light. Here at present I felt afresh, for I had felt it again, how my equilibrium depended on the success of my rigid will, the will to shut my eyes as tight as possible to the truth that what I had to deal with was revoltingly against nature. I could only get on at all by taking nature into my confidence and my account, by treating my monstrous ordeal as a push in a direction unusual, of course, and unpleasant, but demanding, after all, for a fair front, only another turn of the screw of ordinary human virtue. No attempt, none the less, could well require more tact than just this attempt to supply oneself all the nature. How could I put even a little of that article into a suppression of reference to what had occurred? How, on the other hand, could I make reference without a new plunge into the hideous obscure? Well, a sort of answer, after a time, had come to me, and it was so far confirmed as that I was met, incontestably, by the quickened vision of what was rare in my little companion. It was, indeed, as if he had found, even now, as he had so often found at lessons, still some other delicate way to ease me off. Wasn't there light in the fact, which as we shared our solitude broke out with a specious glitter it had never yet quite worn, the fact that, opportunity aiding, precious opportunity which had now come, it would be preposterous with a child so endowed to forego the help one might wrest from absolute intelligence? What had his intelligence been given him for, but to save him? Mightn't one, to reach his mind, risk the stretch of an angular arm over his character? It was as if, when we were face to face in the dining-room, he had literally shown me the way. The roast mutton was on the table, and I had dispensed with attendance. Miles, before he sat down, stood a moment with his hands in his pockets and looked at the joint, on which he seemed on the point of passing some humorous judgment. But what he presently produced was, "I say, my dear, is she really very awfully ill?" "Little Flora? Not so bad, but that she'll presently be better. London will set her up. Bligh had ceased to agree with her. Come here and take your mutton." He alertly obeyed me, carried the plate carefully to his seat, and when he was established went on, "Did Bligh disagree with her so terribly suddenly?" "Not so suddenly as you might think. One had seen it coming on." "Then why didn't you get her off before?" "Before what?" "Before she became too ill to travel." I found myself prompt. "She's not too ill to travel. She only might have become so if she'd stayed. This was just the moment to seize. The journey will dissipate the influence." Oh, I was grand. "And carry it off." I see. Miles, for that matter, was grand too. He settled to his repast with the charming little table manners that from the day of his arrival had relieved me of all grossness of admonition. Whatever he had been driven from school for, it was not for ugly feeding. He was irreproachable, as always, today, but he was unmistakably more conscious. He was discernibly trying to take for granted more things than he found, without assistance, quite easy, and he dropped into peaceful silence while he felt his situation. Our meal was of the briefest, mine a vain pretence, and I had the things immediately removed. While this was done, Miles stood again, with his hands in his little pockets and his back to me, stood and looked out of the wide window through which that other day I had seen what pulled me up. We continued silent while the maid was with us, as silent, it whimsically occurred to me, as some young people who on their wedding journey at the inn feel shy in the presence of the waiter. He turned round only when the waiter had left us. Well, so we're alone. Well, folks, that's the end of that chapter, and that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to be back on Monday to possibly maybe Monday or possibly Wednesday, conclude the Turn of the Screw with chapter 23. Thank you for joining me today, and bye-bye for now.